Humphrey School and one of our most distinguished graduates. Steve Andreasen is a national security consultant in Washington, has been for many years, and he is a consultant to the Nuclear Threat Initiative and its nuclear security project. He also teaches courses here, some you know, at the Humphrey School. He served as Director for Defense Policy and Arms Control at the U.S. National Security Council at the White House, all during the 1990s, from 1993 to January 2001. Previously, during Bush Sr. and Reagan administrations, he worked in the State Department's Bureau of Politico-Military Affairs and the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. He dealt with a wide range of defense policy, arms control, and nuclear weapons issues, as well as intelligence problems. Steve should be an inspiration to our students. He finished here in 1986 and went back to Washington on a Presidential Management Fellowship and has been there ever since. Steve is not a first-time person at this seminar. In fact, I dug up a talk blurb for something he delivered here on Tuesday, January 29th, 2008. He called his talk "Nuclear Weapons and Our World Today." And this is the way the blurb begins. The US and Russia possess 95% of all of the world's nuclear warheads, and they have declared they are no longer each other's enemies. I think I'll let Steve pick it up. Welcome, Steve Andreasen.
So, first of all, thank you all for coming today on a Wednesday early afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I just want to begin by thanking Bob Cooterly, both for the opportunity to be with all of you today. And I have to say, Bob, all the opportunities I've had since I've graduated from the Humphrey School, where Bob was my advisor and mentor, as he still is today to many Humphrey students. As he mentioned, among other things, Bob pointed me in the direction of the Presidential Management Fellowship Program. In an elevator ride, Bob, when the Humphrey School was still in the Social Sciences Tower, in between my first and second year, riding up to the 9th floor, a story that I still tell my students. And the list of students that you've mentored here at the Humphrey School is probably one of the longer lists that anyone here has ever had. And I really count myself lucky and fortunate to have had you in that role. And thank you for everything you've done and continue to do at the school. So this is my second opportunity, as Bob mentioned, to speak at a Freeman seminar, and the first time was indeed back in January of 2008. And as Bob mentioned, I had the same topic and the same title, Nuclear Weapons and Our World Today. And I too went back and looked at those remarks a month or so ago after you had asked me to do this, to remind myself of the world then and what I said about it. And I have to say, the trend line over the last decade in terms of nuclear risks and nuclear threats looks a lot like an EKG in terms of ups and downs. And I have to say, in the world of nuclear weapons, looking like an EKG is not necessarily a good thing. So what I'd like to do briefly today is kind of start where I started back in 2008 and talk about four things that have really not changed in ways that increase nuclear threats and risks. And I say four things really from the collapse of the Soviet Union back in 1991, so over 25 years ago. And then just to make you a bit more nervous, talk about 5 things on top of those 4. These are the points on the EKG that have happened since last I spoke at a Freeman seminar on why things have gotten potentially even more dangerous in the area of nuclear weapons and nuclear risks. And then hopefully close with a few positive things that might be done in terms of reducing the risk of nuclear use. So let me start by going back to 1987 when I first went out to Washington, D.C. as a presidential management fellow. I started working in the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research right out of Humphrey School. And I was assigned to something called the Continuity of Government, or COG program. And the origins of the COG or COG program, as we talked about it when I was in government, go back all the way to the 1950s in the Eisenhower administration, where the onset of nuclear weapons then deployed on ballistic missiles, which was a new development, raised fears that there could be the equivalent of a nuclear Pearl Harbor. So the purpose of the Continuity of Government program was to ensure literally that the government could survive during and after a nuclear war. And that was one of the first things that I was assigned to participate in as a federal employee out of graduate school. So I participated in my first Continuity of Government exercise in the fall of '87. And the scenario for that exercise was one that I'll never forget. Before the exercise started, it was about a week-long exercise. We all went down to a basement area in the State Department to be briefed on the world that we were about to encounter as part of the exercise. And that scenario was truly sobering. It was a nuclear conflict that involved thousands of detonations of nuclear warheads in the United States, in the then Soviet Union, and in Europe. I spent a week after being briefed on that scenario actually involved in the exercise, moving from one location to the next in an effort to not be targeted during the nuclear war, to survive radiation exposure, and basically not give up our location so that we could basically operate in a nuclear war environment for weeks, if not months, a protracted nuclear conflict. The good news for all of us today is that the danger of that kind of nuclear exchange has gone dramatically down with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Cold War political, economic, and military struggle, or the components that truly were existential in terms of their threat to the United States, that is over in the context of the Cold War. But the bad news is that the risk of a nuclear weapon going off today in Minneapolis, or Mumbai, or Islamabad, or London, or Paris, is as high as it has been in 30 years. So why is that? This gets to the 4 reasons that have persisted since my talk in 2008, and very similar to the ones I outlined in 2008. First of all, there are more states with nuclear weapons today, and no guarantee that deterrence, which is a Cold War concept based on a bilateral US-Soviet dynamic, which worked throughout the Cold War, will work in a world with multiple nuclear weapon states. So during the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union faced off in this existential conflict, nuclear deterrence worked, but we were also very lucky. Former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara wrote years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when asked, he said, "It wasn't rationality that saved us, or rational actors during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was luck." And to underscore it, he said, "It was dumb luck." And we were lucky on more occasions than I think the public realizes during the Cold War to escape that period without having a nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. So we have to ask ourselves, how long are we going to be lucky? Can the US stay lucky with respect to China and the US-China dynamic? Will India and Pakistan be lucky in the context of their own bilateral nuclear dynamic, or a dynamic that also includes China? Or will the United States continue to be lucky in the context of our relationship with North Korea, where now both countries have nuclear weapons? In general, the more countries and the more of these nuclear deterrence equations that you have, the more risk and the more risk of nuclear use. So that's reason one why we should still be concerned about this dynamic, the persistent reasons for trouble. The second reason is that the risk of nuclear terrorism remains very real. I think back to the presentation I gave in 2008, and I remember highlighting the 9/11 Commission report, which was done after the 9/11 attacks, and the conclusion of the 9/11 Commission that Al-Qaeda was committed to getting nuclear material for a nuclear weapon and actually building a nuclear bomb. So fast forward to just a few years ago, you remember the suicide bomb attacks that took place in Brussels. And after those attacks, this was in 2016, we learned more about the bombers, and one of the things we learned is that they had an interest in targeting civil nuclear facilities in Belgium. And we've also learned, not just about those attackers, but other attackers, that they're very interested in the location of US nuclear weapons that are stored in Europe, which is actually quite easy to ascertain online. So there's a lot of evidence that the risk of nuclear terrorism remains, on top of the fact that more states have nuclear weapons. And that leads to the third reason for trouble, which is there's a continuing global interest in nuclear energy. And by definition, that leads to a demand for nuclear fuel for civil power reactors, nuclear enrichment technologies, and nuclear reprocessing technologies. And these same technologies that are needed to fuel civil nuclear power are the same technologies that are needed to produce fuel for a nuclear weapon. And finally, the fourth reason for trouble is that this residual nuclear threat from the Cold War, as I said, the Cold War is over, but the actual force postures that accompanied the Cold War have not gone away. So almost 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, even though we're not in an existential conflict between Washington and Moscow, both countries still have over 2,000 nuclear weapons deployed on prompt launch. And what I mean by that is the President of the United States can, during the time I'm giving this talk today, should he choose to do so, order a nuclear strike. And that strike will take place within the 30 minutes it would take for me to give this talk today. And the same is true of the Russian president. So we still have a process and a force structure that are in place that basically are on 30-minute alert between order and detonation on target. So those are the four things that I highlighted back in 2008, and those four things have really persisted. And very similar, as I said, to what I said then, but when I thought about this talk, I thought, basically what's changed? And I came up with 5 things, none of which are, how should I say, positive in the context of reducing the threat of nuclear use. And the first is this Cold War that we lived through also developed within it an arms control architecture. It was built up over many decades of US-Soviet nuclear competition to basically manage and reduce nuclear risks. And what do I mean by Cold War architecture? Primarily a series of treaties and agreements. And those treaties and agreements are going away. I'll just mention 3. One of the initial Cold War era treaties was something called the Anti-Ballistic Missile ABM Treaty, which was concluded in 1972. And it basically limited missile defense systems, and by limiting defenses allowed for offensive systems to also be limited. The offense-defense relationship began being regulated actually during the Nixon era in 1972. Fast forward 30 years, in 2002, one of the first decisions of the George W. Bush administration was to withdraw from the ABM treaty and basically argue that we no longer needed to limit missile defenses. So that treaty and its limitations are gone. In 1987, perhaps the most significant agreement that foreshadowed the end of the Cold War was something called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF Treaty. And what the INF Treaty did is it eliminated an entire class of missiles globally, but in particular from Europe. And these missiles, which were deployed in the late 1970s, early 1980s, were the kind of missiles that generated fears of a decapitating or disarming first strike. For example, they could be fired from Germany and hit Moscow in less than 10 minutes. And vice versa, most European capitals and European leaderships could be eliminated in a similar amount of time. The Trump administration in August of this year withdrew the United States from the INF Treaty, and Moscow too has now said the treaty is no longer operative. The last treaty on nuclear weapons is something that limits the strategic or long-range systems between the United States and Russia. It was concluded by President Obama, and it's called the New START Treaty. The New START Treaty, which came into force in 2011 during the first term of Barack Obama, expires in less than 15 months. Now, the treaty can be extended for 5 years, but the Trump administration has said it will not extend the New START Treaty as it currently is. So, think about it. We're now in a situation where the kinds of notifications that are built into these treaties, the verification, the on-site inspection, the transparency, all of the limits are basically being dismantled. And we're now in a system which economists would either revel in or abhor, which is we're moving into an era that is completely deregulated with respect to nuclear forces. And I would argue that in the case of nuclear weapons, which are still the most deadly weapons that we know, a deregulated system is exactly what you don't want, but that is what we're moving into. There's other treaties and agreements that are also at risk. One of them is the Open Skies Treaty that allows unarmed aircraft with cameras to fly over Russia and the United States. We've conducted over 500 Open Skies flights over Russia. That treaty, too, could be headed for trouble, as the Trump administration has indicated that it might withdraw from Open Skies. And then finally, a treaty negotiated when I was in the White House that I worked on, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which basically bans all nuclear weapon tests. There's a move in the US Senate to advocate to the Trump administration that we should also withdraw from the CTBT. So, no limits on missile defenses, no limits on intermediate range nuclear forces in Europe, no limits on strategic forces, that is the long-range nuclear weapons, no overflights of the United States and Russia, and possibly a return to nuclear testing. All of that is where we're headed potentially in the next few months. Okay, so that's the first spike on the EKG. The second spike on the EKG is these large residual Cold War nuclear force postures that I spoke about, increasingly deregulated. They now persist along new threats in both cyberspace and advances in military technology and artificial intelligence. So some of you might recall President Putin gave a speech a year ago last spring. I was sitting in the Delta Lounge at the Minneapolis airport, And I was not the only one who was watching him give this speech on one of the screens there. It was quite a high-tech video display where he was showing 6 new Russian strategic strike systems. And if you remember, the highlight was a video that included a simulation of one of these new Russian systems actually striking a certain high-end resort in Florida. There was the Trump Mar-a-Lago resort, just to drive home the point. Anyway, these new systems, they're hypersonic, some of them, which means they fly 5 times faster than the speed of sound. And at the same time, you've got these new, faster delivery systems on top of what we already have. You've got credible cyber threats to early warning and command and control systems, the kind of thing that are supposed to detect missile launches and warn leadership. And you're getting to the point where it's not far-fetched to think that a state or a non-state actor could actually spoof or convince the national leadership that there's an incoming ballistic missile attack and trigger a whole host of events. Some of you may remember there was an incident in Hawaii about a year ago where there was an accidental emergency alert sent out. And basically the entire state of Hawaii thought that within 30 minutes there was going to be an incoming ballistic missile attack. Now 30 minutes is about the amount of time that the President of the United States would have, and I'll come back to this, or the President of Russia to make a decision on whether notification of a missile attack is real or false. So although that was an accident, it was actually an alert that was prompted by somebody pushing the wrong button on a simulation. These kinds of accidents, mistakes can happen, or they can be provoked by somebody who wants to simulate that kind of an attack. And in addition to that, you've got artificial intelligence, which by definition is going to speed up a whole host of things, potentially including decision-making, including nuclear decision-making. Which leads to my third spike on the nuclear EKG, so to speak, which is under these circumstances, the amount of decision time that's available to a Russian president or a US president is down to just a handful of minutes in certain scenarios. We lived in that environment during the Cold War, and we thought that the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Cold War would take us out of that kind of hair-trigger posture. It turns out we never really got out of that posture, and there's a lot of things that are happening now that would make it worse. So one of my colleagues at the Nuclear Threat Initiative is a former US Senator, Sam Nunn, who's actually the longtime CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. This is the group that I consult with. And he actually was in a meeting with President Putin about a decade ago, where Senator Nunn, who's been warning about short decision time for much of his career, had this conversation with President Putin. And President Putin actually perked up and said, actually, the decision time that I have is less than 10 minutes. And at some point, the response is simply automatic. So that's the situation that we're in with respect to decision time. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. Which leads to the fourth spike on the EKG, which is, as we're struggling to manage this Cold War legacy, and as arms control and the restrictions and regulatory regime is collapsing, as cyber technologies emerge, and as decision time is shrinking, you would think that we have even more reason and rationale to talk, in particular, to Russia. But our response the last 5 years vis-a-vis Russia has been to talk less and to do it deliberately. So in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis, which was 5 years ago in 2014, basically the response of the United States and NATO was to shut down most of the regular channels of dialogue, including channels of dialogue for crisis management. So there was something called the NATO-Russia Council that came into being in 2002 that was meant to be a forum where NATO and Russia could sit down and talk about crises to make sure that they didn't escalate. And basically, one of the deliberate acts of the US administration and NATO in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis was to shut down the NATO-Russia Council to punish the Russians. And that wasn't the only thing. NATO basically adopted an approach which they called no business as usual, where we shut down the kind of regular channels of discussion and engagement that we had built up in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it's dangerous at any time to not be talking when there's the potential for escalation and conflict. I would argue it's even more dangerous when there's a lot of dry tinder that's lying around in Europe today, which is the case in the aftermath of Ukraine. So just last year, we passed the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I in 1918. And that war began 4 years earlier than that in 1914. And it all began very quickly. Within a month, we went from a situation where Europe was at peace, from an assassination, an escalation, a crisis, a lack of dialogue, and a conflict that lasted 4 years and cost 40 million lives. The difference today is that you can put together a very similar scenario for escalation in Europe today that could quickly escalate to threats of nuclear use or actual nuclear use. And the death toll would mount up much more fast and more quickly and more deadly, potentially, than it did during the First World War. Which leads to the fifth spike on the EKG, which is the time when leaders and policymakers in the United States and Russia and other countries had anything close to a personal memory or actual policy experience with nuclear weapons and their effects is becoming more distant. So one of my first bosses in the State Department when I moved to Washington in 1987 was a gentleman by the name of Paul Nitze. And Paul Nitze, when I started working for him in the State Department, was 81 years old. This was during the second Reagan term, and at that time he was an arms control negotiator. He had been Deputy Secretary of Defense during the Johnson administration, so his work in government spanned many decades going back previous to the beginning of World War II. But one of his first jobs immediately after the war was to head something called the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey with a gentleman by the name of George Ball. And Paul Nitze and George Ball went to Hiroshima as the first civilians after the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to record and witness the devastation. He never forgot that, and he devoted his life to U.S. national security policy and the reduction and elimination of nuclear threats. He worked in the State Department as I did, my first boss, for a guy by the name of George Shultz, who's still going strong at the age of 99, who was Secretary of State at the time. George Shultz was on a troop ship on his way to Japan when he heard the news of the Hiroshima bombings. And that stuck in George Shultz's mind, and he was a committed activist on nuclear weapons issues and still is today, including with President Reagan at Reykjavik, where they discussed the elimination of all nuclear weapons. I should mention, by the way, Max Campbellman, who is a longtime Minnesotan, passed away 5 years ago at the age of 94. There's a plaque outside, I think it's the Humphrey foyer for Max, who actually was a conscientious objector in World War II and was at the University of Minnesota working on his PhD at the time. He actually worked on something as a conscientious objector, and I say worked on because he was in effect drafted into it. Something that in retrospect is known as the Great Starvation Experiment at the University of Minnesota, which conducted research into starvation during the Second World War, anticipating the collapse of Europe economically and also anticipating what was happening to US soldiers that were being held in captivity. Max basically, among other things, worked on Hubert Humphrey's first mayoral campaign and in his first Senate office, but became a committed diplomat, and because of his experience in World War II, somewhat different than George Shultz's and Paul Nitz's, also became a committed advocate for nuclear elimination. As George Shultz said when he testified to Congress a year ago, and I think his words can't be improved on, quote, "I fear people have lost that sense of dread," unquote, with respect to nuclear weapons. And I see that in terms of the people who are actually working on these issues today in comparison to the people who I started working on these issues with not that long ago. So, against that kind of foundation, those 4 foundational points and 5 points on the EKG, it sounds like a bleak assessment, but I actually do believe that there's things that we can do and reason to hope. Keep in mind President Kennedy in one of his brief speeches as president when he said, "The world was not meant to be a prison in which humankind awaits its execution." There's things that we can and should do to reduce nuclear risks. The first thing we need to do is to resume dialogue with Russia. And that dialogue needs to be focused on preventing the risk, as I say, of unmanaged competition, in particular in the area of nuclear weapons. So one way to start is to restart the kind of crisis management dialogue in the NATO-Russia Council, or if it can't be done there, bilaterally between Washington and Moscow. So you actually have uniformed military professionals and diplomats who are engaging with each other routinely, so that when crises arrive, you actually have dialogue and a greater degree of understanding and reduce the risk of the kind of escalation where leaders can actually get to the point of considering nuclear use. So that would be a sensible first step. Now, to do that politically in Washington today, I'll be honest with you, is extremely difficult. I have never seen Washington as polarized as it is today. I thought it was polarized when I ran for Congress in 2001 and 2002. That was a walk in the park compared to what Washington is today, I have to say. And I've never seen Washington so polarized about Russia for a whole host of reasons, relating to Russian election interference, relating to Ukraine, and relating to the nature of Putin's regime. So in that environment, it's extremely difficult for this president in particular, but any president, to reach out to Russia and make the case why we need to have dialogue with Russia. One thing that could improve that situation is a bilateral effort from Congress, from the House and the Senate, Republicans and Democrats, to form some kind of a liaison group with the administration. This is the kind of thing that was done when I was working in the State Department. George Shultz insisted on having exactly that kind of group to talk about arms control. It was called the House and Senate Observer Groups. And they worked with the administration kind of hand in hand to create a foundation for dialogue. And so the other thing that comes out of that dynamic is you don't have Democrats or Republicans attacking the other for making concessions by talking. So we need that kind of foundational dialogue within Washington almost before we re-engage with Russia, but we need both of those things now. The second thing I think we need to do is look at what I call the issue of sole authority. And what do I mean by the issue of sole authority? Today, one man in Washington and probably one man in Moscow has the authority to order the launch of nuclear weapons. And that authority is not questioned. And the system was designed and built that way. The system was designed in the United States so that any nuclear use had to be authorized by the president, but only the president could authorize nuclear use. And you had to ensure that the president could do that quickly and without question. And that is still the system that we have today, a system where only the President of the United States can authorize the use of nuclear weapons, But only the President of the United States can do it, and he can't be stopped. Okay, so this is not an issue. If you think I'm making a point about Donald Trump and the Trump presidency, I'm not. The issue of sole authority has been with us ever since we've had nuclear weapons. Those of you who've seen the documentary, The Fog of War, with Robert McNamara, at the end of it, the documentary is really focused on his Vietnam experience, but he talks about nuclear weapons and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he says, why should one man, and I'm paraphrasing, have the ability in Washington and Moscow to end the world in 15 minutes today? And that is an issue that we should be taking up today. There are steps that the executive branch and Congress can take to ensure that any decision regarding nuclear use is deliberative, that it's broadly informed by consultations, and that it's legal. So one thing we could do is we could legislate a congressional role in the authorization of nuclear use, at least in certain circumstances, in particular first use. And you could also require or encourage in legislation consultations that are not now required within the executive branch prior to nuclear use or between the executive branch and Congress. The third thing we could do is a broad set of activities that I would say would lead to a safer nuclear posture in the United States than we have today. So what do I mean by that? We're actually planning to invest $1.3 trillion with a T, trillion dollars, in modernizing the nuclear stockpile over the next 30 years. $1.3 trillion. And why I don't want to critique the entire investment, I can just say that's a lot of money. It's not necessary, and the opportunity costs both on the defense side and on the civil side are substantial. But if we are going to make investments, and we do need to make some, we should do it in ways that basically make the risk of nuclear use as small as possible and increase decision time for our leaders. So the first thing we should do is we should invest in nuclear forces that are survivable and secure. That is, survivable forces that can't be knocked out in a first strike attack, and communications to ensure that the national leadership can communicate with those nuclear forces under any circumstances. That reduces the hair trigger, so a decision maker doesn't think that he or she has to make a decision quickly, because if he doesn't or she doesn't, the nuclear forces could be eliminated. Secondly, the flip side of that is we should disinvest from nuclear forces that are vulnerable to attack or that have to be deployed on prompt launch so they can be fired before they're hit. So, consistent with this emphasis on survivability, consistent with forces that can be securely communicated with, we should eliminate forces that are vulnerable to a first strike. And by this I mean primarily land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles. These are the forces in the United States arsenal that, first of all, could be hit and targeted and eliminated quite quickly within 30 minutes. And so they're deployed on prompt launch so they can be fired within minutes. Those are hair trigger forces that are increasingly risky in the world we live in today. We should move away from that, and we should invest in survivable forces, primarily forces, i.e. submarines at sea. The third thing we should do in terms of investments is we should avoid investing in usability. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of talk today in investing in low-yield nuclear weapons or redeploying sea-launched cruise missiles that President George H.W. Bush took out of the force decades ago. And those are missiles and programs that, by making nuclear weapons more usable, you're trying to convince the other side that lower yield weapons are more usable, so they shouldn't use their weapons. It actually encourages a different dynamic. It encourages people to think that nuclear weapons can be used at some level, and basically diminishes what I think most people still believe, which is the risk of any nuclear use opens up the potential for a much wider nuclear war, no matter what attempts are made to limit it. So we should not be encouraging these kind of low-yield nuclear weapons or redeployments. And if anything, if we do it, other states are going to follow in our lead. And that leads to this question of, can we really maintain deterrence if everybody is thinking that way? If India and Pakistan is thinking that way, if North Korea is thinking that way, if they think limited nuclear use is a possibility. So the final recommendation I give is that we should also think about returning US nuclear weapons that are now deployed in Europe back to the United States. For the simple reason that those weapons deployed in Europe today have no military utility whatsoever. During the Cold War, we had over 7,000 nuclear weapons deployed in Europe. These were the battlefield tactical nuclear weapons that we thought we needed if we were going to defeat massive Soviet conventional armies coming through Germany. So with the Cold War ended, the military rationale for having those kinds of weapons went away. And again, George Herbert Walker Bush, the first President Bush, actually withdrew almost all of them from Europe, leaving behind only a few hundred located in 5 countries at 6 bases. This is not secret information, it's pretty easily obtained on the internet, as I said earlier. So there's no military rationale for those weapons, but there's a great risk that they are at risk of terrorism and instability. And as an example, I give you the country of Turkey. So 3 years ago, there was a military coup in Turkey. And if press reports are to be believed, also as President Trump actually just recently confirmed, there are US nuclear weapons stored at the Incirlik Air Base in Turkey. What happened at Incirlik Air Base during the coup 3 years ago? The base commander joined the coup. So the US facility where there were US nuclear weapons stored and US personnel based was taken over by the coup commander, who was then defeated by the Turkish government. But there was no guarantee at some point that the Turkish base commander during that time wouldn't turn his forces on the US personnel and basically say, I'm holding you hostage, and I'm holding those weapons hostage. It didn't happen, but there was no guarantee. And if you want to be even more concerned about Turkey, months before that, all US dependents had been evacuated from Incirlik before the coup. Not because of concern about a coup, but concern about ISIS. So you can argue rationally that 3 years ago, the Obama administration knew enough to know that if US dependents weren't safe at Incirlik, and if the base had been taken over by a coup commander, that was the time to take nuclear weapons out of Turkey. We didn't do that. And those nuclear weapons are still there, and they've become an issue again in the context of the current US-Turkish relationship and concerns about our ability to interact positively, I'll just leave it at that, with the current Turkish government. So, the last thing I want to say is, this is a US election year, of course. I should say, we're a year away from a US election. We're about to go into a US election year. And anything nuclear in the United States is inherently presidential. So any change in US nuclear policy and posture really does require presidential leadership. In fact, it necessitates presidential leadership. My first day on the White House NSC staff in January of 1993, the then National Security Advisor, Tony Lake, had all of the NSC directors who worked on the staff over to meet with him privately. And Tony Lake said to me, you've got a broad portfolio. I was the director for defense policy and arms control on the NSC staff. The one thing he said I want you to keep in mind is the one thing the president wants you to do, which is to negotiate a comprehensive ban on nuclear tests. Bill Clinton was a huge devotee of John F. Kennedy, who negotiated the Limited Test Ban Treaty. And What had failed to be done since that treaty was done in 1963 was to ban all nuclear weapons tests, the so-called Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And the president wanted to get that done. And Tony Lake said to me, the president is prepared to do and wants you to tell him what he has to do in order to get that done. And 4 years later, that treaty was opened for signature at the United Nations in 1996. But at many times along the way, the President of the United States had to be personally engaged. We had for decades said that we could not have a nuclear stockpile unless we tested nuclear weapons. Changing the status quo really does require a president to be personally engaged, personally involved. So today, I think one of the things that we all need to ask ourselves is, as we look at the presidential contenders, if we think nuclear policy today is a front burner concern, who amongst the many candidates for president is the person who can actually show that kind of sustained commitment and leadership to change what today is a very dangerous status quo? So with that, Bob, I'm happy to answer any questions you or others may have.
I think we probably have a lot of questions. That was terrific. Yes, please. And please identify yourself before you ask the question. I know that you two know each other, but for the benefit of everybody else that's here.
I'm Jay Humans from Rochester. Should we be lucky enough to change leadership in this country, what is, as far as nuclear weapons is concerned, Steve, is there a possibility that we can reverse the situation right now and get people to realize that some of these safeguards have to be reinstated? And I don't know, that's it. Are you hopeful that if the right person is elected, we can do this?
So I am, Jay, and there's, as I say, some near-term steps that could be done, and I actually don't rule out even the Trump administration taking at least one or two of them. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is we're approaching the most significant agreement in the area of nuclear weapons is something called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, which basically stipulates that there are 5 nuclear weapon states: the United States, Russia, China, France, and the UK, and everybody else who signs that agreement is a non-nuclear weapon state. And every 5 years, there's a review conference where those states come together, and it's happening next April, to basically discuss the implementation of that treaty, a treaty where, by the way, all the nuclear weapon states have committed to work towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. So one thing that we're discussing and we're trying to put forward to the nuclear weapon states is that they reaffirm what was a Reagan-Gorbachev era agreement, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. This was something President Reagan first said. He got President Gorbachev to agree to it. And recently, the Russians and the Chinese have proposed to the US government that one thing we do, that the nuclear weapon states do before this conference, is to have that kind of foundational commitment and to state it publicly. Now, a public statement like that, of course, only goes so far. It doesn't change a lot of the things that I spoke about in my talk today. But I think that kind of public reaffirmation by presidents, in particular in light of things that have happened recently, would be perceived positively by publics, as it was during the 1980s. The other thing is this New START agreement that I talked about, the treaty that limits long-range strategic forces between the United States and Russia. Although it expires in February 2021, only a couple of weeks after the next inaugural, 15 months from now, there is a lot of pressure on the administration to simply extend that treaty for 5 years, and that pressure comes primarily from the US military and the US intelligence community, who sees great value in the kind of regulations that I was talking about: notifications, inspections, restrictions, predictability. So although the Trump administration has not said that it will extend New START, it's possible that they will. The president's opposition to it primarily relates to the fact it was a treaty negotiated by President Obama. But having said that, There is some hope that the US military and the intelligence community can bring the president along on that, and that he actually sees value, and I'll be blunt, political value, in reaching an agreement with Russia sometime next year to extend this treaty. If he doesn't, if there is a new president, that new president will have a couple of weeks to extend it, and it could be done that quickly. So those are the two things I'd say that could be done in the next 12 months or so that might begin to at least slow down the momentum of some of the things I've talked about and get people thinking differently.
My name is Huzbakht. I'm International Fellows of Humphrey program. I'm from Tajikistan. This is I'm former citizens of Soviet Union, and I remember the period when between President Gorbachev and President Ronald Reagan was signing the agreement concerning the reducing of nuclear weapons. Yeah, and we were very happy in this time. And my questions, but today we can see opposite situation. I mean that this problem is increasing every day. My questions concern the level of power of public society, of activists, of non-government organization to do influence to two governments to reduce this problem.
So it's an excellent question, and you referenced the Reagan-Gorbachev era. Those of us who lived through it remember that was a time in particular in the first Reagan term, 1981, 82, 83, where the kinds of activists and level of protests that we see today on issues like climate change existed in the area of nuclear weapons. Hundreds of thousands of people turning out in the streets of Europe concerned about nuclear weapons deployments, huge demonstrations in the United States, the nuclear freeze movement. All of this had a real impact on Ronald Reagan, who turns out, even before then, was really a nuclear abolitionist. Ronald Reagan viscerally was opposed to nuclear weapons. He wanted to get rid of them. And these massive street protests, the nuclear freeze movement, the opposition that was in Europe that was putting pressure on Allied leaders, I mean, all of this was a real factor in leading to the agreements from the Reagan era, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty that you referred to, but also other agreements that followed to dramatically reduce the numbers of nuclear weapons that were deployed. So that kind of public pressure and those kinds of campaigns by activists can be crucially important. Now I have to say, just like leaders have lost touch with the devastation potentially of nuclear weapons, I think honestly publics too have, to a certain extent lost touch, or they're not as concerned about nuclear risks. And so the question is, how do you generate that level of concern? How can you generate that kind of public pressure? My own view is that there's really an inside game and an outside game. I think potentially much easier is to get a certain number of activists who can target and influence leaders in the United States, whether it's their representatives in Congress or the administration. And that can be done effectively sometimes without the specter of a mass movement behind you. It's more effective if you've got hundreds of thousands of people in the street, but I'm not sure how realistic that is today. But the one thing I would say is that the more leaders talk about these issues, the more likely you are to get kind of concerned citizen engagement, which is crucial, and potentially see that kind of a movement, even if it's not on the scale of the 1980s or the climate change movement today. When you saw how one teenage activist on the issue of climate has literally changed the debate in a number of European capitals, helped provoke a movement, has generated support from thousands, hundreds of thousands of people globally. So that kind of effort can be done, but it starts with leaders who are prepared to talk about it. I mean, I have to say, Jay and Britta, very kind of you to come up from my congressional campaign years in Rochester. But I was always struck, and I ran for Congress in 2001, 2002, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And I was always struck about how interested people were in talking about security issues, not just in the aftermath of 9/11, but just in general. Leaders sometimes assume that those are the kinds of issues that people don't want to hear or they don't want to talk about. It turns out, if you sit down and talk to people about it, they're actually quite interested in talking about it and in doing something about it. So that's where I'd start.
May I interject a question here that's related to that I was thinking about during your talk? If you think about the people who've been active in your organization, I don't really see much of an ideological pattern there. If anything, these people may be a bit conservative on average. But what's the ideological vectoring on this issue anyway? I mean, what's left and what's right? Who are the people who identify with this kind of issue, other than people who kind of have had first-hand experience? I mean, how does it play out politically and within the Congress? It's never been clear to me.
So it's a very good question. So in my work with the Nuclear Threat Initiative that I started in 2003, one of the projects, my major project, has been to work with former Secretary of State George Shultz, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, and former Senator Sam Nunn on a project to basically reinvigorate the Reagan-Gorbachev vision of working towards a world free of nuclear weapons. And George Shultz, who is as Republican as Republicans get, basically says this isn't a bipartisan initiative, even though Kissinger and Shultz are two Republicans, Nunn and Perry are two Democrats. He says it's not bipartisan, it's nonpartisan. And nuclear threat reduction should be a nonpartisan issue. So, you know, if you fast forward to today's generation, first of all, it's hard to make a case today that anything is nonpartisan because we become so polarized. On nuclear weapons issues, it turns out there's some issues that are extremely polarizing. For example, missile defense, which has always been a Republican issue, that we need to get out from the constraints of the ABM Treaty, we need to build missile defenses. But there's a lot of Republicans today in Congress who look at a $1.3 trillion price tag for modernizing the nuclear force and say, can we really afford that? And there's a lot of Democrats who not only are concerned about affordability, but as I say, developing more usable weapons. So I think there's the potential for nuclear threat reduction to be more of a nonpartisan or bipartisan issue than partisan issue. But one thing that's preventing this right now is the partisan nature of the Russia debate, Bob. Because right now, it used to be that Republicans were always, in my era, thought to be very tough on the Soviet Union, to date myself, and then Russia. And it was the Democrats who were arguing for engagement, for dialogue. Now some of the hardest advocates or critics of Russia are on the Democratic side, motivated by the election interference issue and what it did to a Democratic candidate 3 years ago. And what they see is the president and his, what they perceive to be either, how should I say, unwise dalliance with Vladimir Putin or unguided willingness to accept Russian explanations. So the partisanship on Russia actually, you know, does contribute to partisanship on a whole host of things that are Russia related. And on nuclear threat reduction, the US and Russia are still key, so that's a real spillover. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
When most people hear about nuclear threat in the United States, I don't think they think so much about Russia as much as they think about rogue states like North Korea and Iran. Is anything being done to set up this United States policy versus?
Yeah.
And sir, could you say who you are, sir, please?
Irving Farm.
Thank you. So I'll address Iran and North Korea because in some ways there's been progress and setbacks on both. With respect to Iran, of course, Iran did have, going back to the late 90s, early 2000s, a covert nuclear weapons program. Iran was basically developing the technology to enrich uranium and to build a nuclear bomb. And they were caught, and the United Nations put sanctions on Iran, and negotiations took place, including in the George W. Bush administration, but significantly in the Obama administration, to basically try and curtail Iran's nuclear program and ensure that they couldn't develop a nuclear weapon. And an agreement was reached. It was called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in the last 2 years of the Obama administration that basically restricted Iran's civil nuclear technology so that they couldn't quickly break out and produce material for a weapon or produce a weapons program. And the Trump administration, Donald Trump, when he ran for president, said it was the worst agreement ever. And a year ago, or a little over a year ago, he withdrew the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So that agreement really did restrict Iran's pathways to a nuclear weapon. The Trump administration was opposed to it because it said over time the restrictions would sunset. And in some cases that was true, but not in all cases. But the bottom line is we're much better off having that agreement in place, restricting Iran's pathways, making sure that if they broke out of the agreement, it would be months before they could produce material for a weapon, than we are today. Because what's happened a year after the Trump administration withdrew from the agreement, Iran is slowly coming out of the restrictions. So, you know, Iran is one of the two crucial states that could have a nuclear weapon in the decades since I've spoken, where you've seen ups and downs on the nuclear EKG. So North Korea, similarly, this is one area that I would give the Trump administration some credit, which is North Korea is a unique society, and leadership emanates with one person. And just like I said, anything in the United States that's nuclear is inherently presidential. If you're ever going to restrict and possibly roll back North Korea's nuclear weapons program, and unlike Iran today, North Korea actually has nuclear weapons, okay? They've got tens of nuclear weapons, many of which have been produced in the last decade, and they've improved their ballistic missile program, so they actually have delivery vehicles that can threaten South Korea, threaten Japan, and possibly even the United States. So that situation's gotten worse in terms of the threat. But what President Trump did, which no other president has done, is he said about 18 months ago, I'm prepared to sit down with the leader of North Korea and talk about a nuclear weapons-free Korean peninsula. And so there's been not one, not two, but 3 summit meetings between Trump and Kim Jong-un to try and change this dynamic and get the one person who counts in North Korea to agree to restrict and possibly roll back their program. Now, I give the president credit for saying, I'm prepared to meet with him, because that was the only way you were ever going to reach that society, is to have that kind of president-to-president meeting. What they failed to do is to have the kind of detailed talks, negotiations, and preparation that's necessary. And I say this as an objective observer of the Trump presidency. You know, the Trump presidency at the presidential level is somewhat uncertain, somewhat undisciplined, and very unpredictable in terms of policy. And that emanates from the president. That's how he operates. But he also has a government that isn't staffed to compensate for that. So you've got a National Security Council staff at the White House whose job it should be to coordinate policy and to be a disciplinarian. That's gone to not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 national security advisors in 3 years. I worked at the Clinton White House for 8 years. I worked for 2 national security advisors in 8 years. So there's been tremendous staff turnover and very little ability to put together the kind of negotiating position with North Korea to actually follow up the president's right instinct, which is to engage North Korea at the top. So I would argue, 1, we should try and get back to the restrictions that were in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran. Whether there's going to be a willingness to do that, either by this president or the next president, remains to be seen. And how much damage is done in the interim make that very difficult to do. And with respect to North Korea, we need the kind of detailed kind of preparation and engagement that we haven't yet seen to follow up the president's initiative.
Time for one more question. Yes, sir.
I'm Tarun Gaba. I'm also an international fellow, like Pushpak. I'm from India. First of all, I'd like to compliment on the presentation which we had. It was highly informative and concern-raising for us. My question is, like, at the onset of your presentation, you mentioned that the danger of nuclear exchange has reduced, but the risk of like any nuclear weapon taking off has increased in the past decade. So which are like the most likelihood originators of such kind of a nuclear weapon taking place, any state or non-state actors? which is the most likely one from where such kind of danger can emanate?
So, thank you. To be clear, what I said was that the danger of a full-scale nuclear war involving thousands of nuclear warheads between the United States and then Soviet Union has greatly reduced with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the Cold War. But you're right, I think the risk of nuclear use has increased, not on that cataclysmic level, but on a level that could be cataclysmic, in particular for the regions where it takes place. So to answer your question, as I look at the global landscape today, I'm most concerned about India and Pakistan for a whole host of reasons. Pakistan by itself is a country with nuclear weapons that produces nuclear material for weapons. It has, first of all, an extremist and terrorist threat within the country. We know that they've targeted facilities where nuclear weapons have been based and located. And they border a country where they've had, depending on how you want to count, 4 large-scale conventional wars where both sides, now Pakistan and India, have nuclear weapons. And I should add that there's been, even recently, within the last 12 months, the potential for not only escalation, but potential nuclear threats in the context of what's taken place between India and Pakistan and Kashmir. So you've got a situation in India and Pakistan where, and by the way, they don't have the kind of early warning systems, command and control systems that the United States and the Soviet Union had, separated by the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Arctic. I mean, they literally border each other. The risk of a conventional attack where one side or the other could consider nuclear use to be essential for its survival, is a scenario that I worry about quite a bit. I also worry about extremists and terrorists getting access to nuclear material from Pakistan, possibly being able to use that either as a dirty bomb or an actual nuclear explosive. And the final thing is, I worry about the US and Russia and Europe. I don't think, for example, today, Vladimir Putin in Moscow or Donald Trump in Washington is considering a bolt from the blue nuclear attack against the other. That's not what is happening today. But I do worry about the security landscape in Europe and the potential for a crisis that could involve Russia and NATO, and both sides making nuclear threats, and the risk of an accident or a mistake or a miscalculation, the kind that you see in crises throughout history. As I said, the World War I example is a good one, where we went from a peaceful July summer to full-scale war a month later in August, and most people, the classic quote from that era is a German diplomat was asked, how did it happen? And he said, if we only knew. So a lot of times these crises, can happen and escalate quickly and get out of control quickly. And in the US, Russia, Europe context, I worry about that.
Thank you, Steve, very much.